our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's Unspun. I wanted to take you inside one of my classes for a minute. We're just about at the end of our term here in North Carolina in the United States, and I was showing my students about eye tracking. This is where they actually take a little camera and it points at your eyes and it can measure the reflections in your eyes and tell what you're looking at a screen and for how long. So I was showing my students some videos of eye tracking being done on pages of news sites. Now you have to remember that many students who go into journalism do it because they really like writing. They like putting words together and capturing people's imagination and those kind of things. And what you see from the eye tracker about how audiences look at news can be a little bit depressing. Because, a journalist will spend a lot of time doing the research and the planning and the writing and making a story the best that it can be. And when they do that, they're hoping somebody's going to read it. But if you look at the results from eye tracking, what you will actually see is that people look at pictures first, definitely, and then probably the next thing they may look at is the headlines. Those stories that they work really hard on are way down on the list. The headlines are words that are written by someone, but they're a very small set of words, and they actually get written after someone has done all of the work on the story. That can be a little bit depressing to someone who spends all that time putting the story together. But because headlines do attract so much attention, I thought it would be a good idea to take a little bit of time to talk about headlines this week, how they're put together, where they come from, and then I wanted to go through some of the latest research that they have on headlines and notifications and the effect that they have on how you might understand the news. Sound good? Well, then let's get unspun. So when you think about a headline, what are some of the jobs that a headline has to do? They have a few sort of big jobs. First, they need to be accurate, which means they need to summarize the story correctly. They need to tell the truth. And the second is they need to be intriguing, right? So they need to get someone to want to read a story, or in the digital way that news gets delivered now, they need to attract that engagement, hopefully in the form of a click. And then the third thing is that they need to be adequate. So an adequate headline is one that not only tells the truth about the story, but tells enough that you know what you're going to get when you go from that headline to the story. I'm pretty sure you've had the experience of reading a headline and then you click on it and you go to the story and the story is not at all what the headline is about, or it's mostly about something else, and you probably find that pretty frustrating. I know I do. So we need to try to not do that when we write headlines as well. Now there's some specific jobs too. So a headline has to entice the reader, so they have to do that by attracting attention. They have to summarize the story, meaning say what the story is about. And another thing that headlines do that I think you don't often think about is that they capture mood and tone. An example that I use with my students is from quite a while ago in 2001 when someone was actually putting powdered anthrax in envelopes and sending it to important people. Oftentimes it was being sent to members of the media themselves. Anthrax is a disease that you can get, and if you inhale it and get anthrax in your lungs, it will usually kill you. If you get anthrax by touching it, you can get something called cutaneous anthrax, which we all learned at the time that this was happening. It meant you got this bad infection around the place where the anthrax entered your body, and you'd get a lot of swelling and things like that. National Enquirer has been in the news a great deal lately. A staff member at the National Enquirer was actually one who died from anthrax in that incident. And as you can imagine, all of the media had a lot of interest in this story because they were directly affected by it. And so, going back to that idea of tone and style, we found that newspapers like the Washington Post and the LA Times covered the story with very serious headlines. Anthrax found in local newsroom, those kind of things. But the New York Post, which is a newspaper in New York City that is in the tabloid style, which means that it often has these giant headlines on the front page that are maybe just 2 or 3 words. They actually had an editorial assistant named Joanna Hooden who contracted cutaneous anthrax in her middle finger. They had a picture of her on the front page holding up her bandaged middle finger, which is an obscene gesture here, and the page headline was "Anthrax This," with an exclamation mark. So that's just an example of how a headline can help capture the tone of a story or of a publication. Headlines have some secondary jobs as well. In a print publication, they're part of the design of the pages, for example, with larger headlines being seen as more important than smaller headlines. We call this grading the story. In fact, journalists have a word for very giant type on a page if it's not a usual tabloid style kind of thing, but this very giant type, and they call it second coming type. The idea being that you would only use it if you had a super big and important emergency that would be the kind of thing people would save newspaper covers for. Second coming referring to like the second coming of Christ in Christianity. After the September 11th bombings in New York, for example, many newspapers had that second coming type headline on the top, and that was actually the first time I had ever seen that in my life. And that shows you that it's part of the design, saying, oh, this is super important, but it's also grading that story. In fact, those eye-tracking studies have even been done making up a page that doesn't have real words on it. It just has dummy text, made-up gibberish kind of things with headlines of different sizes. You can ask people to point to what is the most important thing on that page, and they will make those judgments based on the size of the headline alone. Because headlines have that larger type size in print, and because they have that limited number of characters online, they're actually very, very difficult to write. It usually takes my students about 4 weeks to get the hang of the very basics of headline writing, and that's before you even get into optimizing them. When it comes to writing headlines, there's some conventions, some standard practices around writing them. Usually a headline's written in subject-verb order, so the actor doing the action to the thing that is acted on. So you'd say dog bites man, you would not say dog bitten by man. Because you're limited in space, there are some things you do to make space less necessary. So for example, you often won't use helper words like the word the or other articles. And you can replace the word and with a comma, like baker, florist join forces for Valentine's Day, for example. Headlines are usually written in the present tense, even when they're about past events. So if there was a car accident yesterday that killed 2 people, you wouldn't say the car accident killed 2, you would say the car accident kills 2. And then in a headline, it's important to not use abbreviations that are unfamiliar to your audience, because a lot of people are only going to read that headline. So if they don't know what the acronym is, that can be a problem. And then you also don't repeat information inside of headlines, again, just to kind of save that space. And then this wasn't as important. You want to use attribution in headlines in order to help stay out of legal trouble. So for example, you wouldn't want to say Smith robs bank. You would instead want to say police say Smith robs bank, or Smith robs bank, police, or something like that. The kind of attribution is a big one. And another big one is to make sure that the story and the headline actually match up. I'm going to put in the show notes a link to a tweet that I saw on Tuesday about a New York Times headline. And the tweet was talking about how the subheading of the Times story was that young people are not going to vote for Democrats because of Gaza. But even though that was in a headline on the story, it was like paragraph 23 inside the story itself. And that's a bad headline practice. If you find that the thing that you want to write the headline about is buried very far down in the story, journalists will call that burying the lead. And it's a sign that probably you need to be rewriting the story before you write the headline. Now, of course, we know that most headlines are delivered online now. They'll show up on a device like a phone, a little small screen, and they'll be distributed to people by algorithms. And because of these 2 factors, it changes the way that you have to write your headlines. Probably the most important thing is that headlines that are delivered online are deconstructed from their context. So think about this. If you can imagine a newspaper, right? If I write a headline on a page that is printed, I'm going to have a whole story there. I might have a picture or a graphic or some other kind of image. I may even have a section header that says sports or business or something, so you know the context in which you should understand the headline. When a headline is delivered online, particularly if it's just forwarded or it's shared on social media, it just doesn't have that context. And a lot of times people will see headlines as the result of a search on a search engine. So this can be searching by looking for a hashtag in social media. It can be actually typing in a question on a search engine. And as a journalist, your ability to work with the algorithms on the search engine or the social media site can make the difference in your story even getting seen at all. Because of this, you can think of headlines that are written for digital as having 2 audiences. The first audience are those live readers. So these are the actual humans who are going to see the headline. And the second audience is the search engines. And the search engines have a lot of specific needs. Let's talk about the live readers first. For an online headline for a live reader, it's important to be clear and concise. In print, you might say something like, "Lawmakers eye business bill." And that might be okay in print because you would assume that if I'm reading it on a page that says Milwaukee Sentinel on the top, I'm talking about Milwaukee lawmakers or Wisconsin lawmakers or something like that. If I'm reading that headline online or I'm seeing it on social media or in a search results page, I have no idea what lawmakers you're talking about, so I need to be more specific. I might say something like, "Wisconsin lawmakers to vote on business tax for small businesses," to be more specific. Or maybe "Wisconsin lawmakers to vote on tax for small businesses," to make it specific, yet also concise. But I need to provide that extra detail for those live readers. In a print headline, you can be coy, you can be mysterious or punny, using the information in the form of a pun. That does not work well without the context. Anthrax this would not have made sense without that picture. Online headlines can be interesting, but they can't be mysterious. This one actually is a little bit nuanced, because in order to get people to click on a headline, having a little bit of a mystery can sometimes be useful, but it can also just really annoy your readers and they learn to skip those kind of clickbait headlines. For live readers, it's also helpful to show the benefits of reading the story. So if they're going to learn 10 things, it's good to say that in the headline because that does encourage people to click through. For search engines, you also want to be clear and concise, but it's for a different reason. Some search engines will sometimes limit the number of characters that they consider when they are storing and remembering the headline as a potential answer to a searched question. Writing for search means writing to answer questions, but it also means doing it in the way that the search engine understands information. That means including specific nouns like places, people's names, people's jobs, those kind of things. But it actually goes beyond that to something that's specific to algorithms, which is keywords. Algorithms don't match based on exactly what you said, but they match based on the meaning of what you said, which can lead to a need for those good keywords. Keywords can be related to a topic that you're talking about. For example, you might want to talk about pets, and keywords that go with pets might be cats and dogs. But keywords can also be related to whatever is popular in that time period. You can find lists of trending keywords just with a Google away. You can check out Google Trends to see what keywords are popular at a given time. There are some free tools like keyword.io that can help you to see good keywords, and there are paid tools like SEMrush that can also help a headline writer to find good keywords. But generally, full names of people and places are important. So local baseball coach a hit might be an okay headline in print, a little bit of a pun there, but it would be a bad headline online, where baseball coach Thomas Clark is a hit in Dubuque would be a more specific one. National Public Radio actually offers a pretty good guide for writing digital headlines and offers a couple of other suggestions. One of the things they suggest is in a digital headline, you might use those articles like a or an, although you wouldn't in print. They also suggest using what we'd call an interrogative adverb, which is just a word that asks a question like why or how, which can let someone know that their question might be answered by reading the headline. And they also suggest using imperative language, actually giving the reader a command. Read this, learn this, find this out. And all of this can be helpful for those digital headlines. So journalists spend a lot of time crafting good headlines to attract people to their articles. Is that time that they spend, and in particular, is looking for results for search engines good for you as the person who is getting that news information? When we come back, we'll see what researchers have found out in the last few years about this, and it might surprise you. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Researchers have found that media outlets use some specific strategies to grab our attention. According to one study, reporters often employ clever wordplay and language tricks to make us stop and take notice. So for example, "You won't believe what happened next" is designed to pique your curiosity and draw you in. But it's not just about getting attention. Other researchers have found that the potential for clicks really plays a significant role in shaping which stories journalists consider worth covering at all. The more clicks an article receives, the more important it's perceived to be by the journalists because those clicks are how they get paid. Always remember, media are a business. This can lead you to focus on sensational or provocative stories, and you may have noticed this if you get most of your news online. It may seem to you like the news is fluffier, it doesn't have a lot of important stuff, but it sure has a lot of interesting stuff. If you've noticed that, you're right, and this is why clicks drive what gets covered. And it's also why here in the States right now, the interesting testimony and in the former president's trial is getting all the headlines, and it almost feels like other news just isn't happening, trying to drive clicks. Interestingly, researchers have also discovered that some political groups, particularly on the right, tend to use causal language and slang to appeal to their supporters. So, A headline like "Libs owned again, Trump's epic comeback" is a prime example of this kind of strategy in action. It's a strategy, but it might not work. According to another study, leaving out key information in headlines to tease the reader doesn't always translate to more clicks. In fact, it can make the news source appear less trustworthy, particularly when the headline is phrased as a question. A headline like "Is Katy Perry secretly bankrupt?" might make you want to click, but it also raises doubts about the article's credibility, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. So let's shift gears and explore how social media presentation affects our perception of news headlines. Studies show that people actually have a bias toward thinking news headlines on social media are fake. We've seen all these outrageous claims and sensational stories that seem too good or maybe too bad to be true, but the interesting part is that according to a study, even though we might mistrust a headline, if it has a lot of likes on it, it makes it more believable. So this may help us to identify true news, but it also makes us more susceptible to falling for fake news. So a headline like "Breaking, Cure for Cancer Found" with thousands of likes might seem legitimate, even if it's completely false. And of course, unscrupulous people can use bots to artificially inflate those like numbers. Researchers also have found that seeing a politician's name repeatedly in fake news articles will make people more likely to vote for them later on, called the mere exposure effect, and it's a pretty important psychological phenomenon. However, if the fake news about the politician is all very negative, the effect doesn't work as well. So, what influences our responses to headlines? According to research, headlines with emotions like hope or fear or annoyance can actually shape our trust in information, for example, our trust in science and our willingness to care for our health. A headline like "New study shows coffee drinkers live longer" might make us feel hopeful and more inclined to trust that scientific research. Researchers also found that positive headlines about the future tend to increase trust in news and science the most. This seems like a good thing. On the other hand, studies show that overall emotional reaction to a headline is linked to being worse at discriminating between true and false news. The good news is that thinking carefully can help correct those initial gut reactions to believe false headlines. Taking a moment to reflect and analyze can make a big difference in how you process and share information. And if you want a little bit more information on how to do that, check out my interview with Mike Caulfield in episode 14. Now let's talk about the factors that influence the spread of fake news through online headlines. Researchers found that people share fake news on social media for a bunch of reasons, right? Entertainment, self-promotion, to promote their political beliefs. According to one study, we're also more likely to believe false headlines if the content aligns with our existing views. In other words, studies show that we tend to believe fake news that confirms our biases and preconceptions. A headline like "Shocking name of political candidate caught in massive scandal" is more likely to be believed and shared by people who already have a negative view of that candidate's party. So what do we do to combat that spread? Researchers suggest that improving digital literacy skills, providing ratings of headlines for accuracy along with the headlines, and helping people get responsible reading habits can all help. But it's a collaborative effort and involves governments, social media platforms, and people like you and me. According to some studies, educational ads about fake news have also shown promise in making people more skeptical about false headlines. Different kinds of ads can work in different ways, even if they share similar messages. But the key is to just raise that awareness and help with those critical thinking skills. So the next time you come across a headline that seems too sensational to be true, take a moment to pause and reflect before you click on that share button. Now it's time for this week's Rewind. Have a listen to this clip and see if you can tell what the logic problem is.
We cannot put paralyzing panic and over-practical precautions above Americans working.
That is Sean Hannity talking about the effects of COVID and offering a choice between having restrictions or having business. And that's an either-or fallacy, sometimes called a false choice. It might be possible to still have business but also have some restrictions. Remember that this kind of fallacy is when the speaker is giving you only two very polarized choices when there may be other things that exist. Here's another example.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
That is former U.S. President George W. Bush after the September 11th attacks when he was trying to drum up some support to go in and invade Iraq. He's offering a choice, right? You're either with us or you're against us, and you could be a little bit of both. Some politicians are good at identifying this kind of fallacy, so maybe a little bit of good news there. Here's a couple of examples of when they do.
My understanding from what you said the Democrats oppose is it's going to affect education funding because most of this money covers education. And as a parent, with a median income of $50,000, I would rather pay $500 more for my children's education than to take $500, $48 averaging a month for less funding for my children's education. And I think most parents would agree.
Sure. And
how do you plan on paying for this tax cut or tax refund, whatever you want to call it?
First of all, I will say that that's a false choice. To say that we can't fund schools because we're going to cut your taxes 10% is a false choice. They're setting up that choice to do exactly what they're doing to you right now, which is to confuse you.
The question was being asked at a town hall for New Jersey governor, and the respondent is Chris Christie, and he was governor of New Jersey at the time. The questioner is asking, how can we pay for education if you are promising a tax cut? And Christie points out correctly that there are a lot of things in a budget besides education, so the question is really a false choice. Let's have one more.
What they invariably say is, well, the time has come in our nation's history where we have to choose now between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice.
That is current presidential candidate Robert Kennedy from 15 years ago. He's talking about the environment, and he's also identifying a false choice. We can either have business or we can have climate. When someone's offering you only two choices, one way to get yourself unspun is by thinking if those are really the only two options or if there might be a third way. Thanks for getting unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.